Welcome to the Thrive Show, where we offer you practical advice that can be implemented into your daily spiritual lives to help you build a thriving home and a thriving sphere. Thanks for joining us. Well, hello there, First Church of Christ, and thank you for joining us on this episode of the Thrive Show. Today, I'm joined by my guest, Steve Surbaugh, who is no stranger to FCC, but many of you probably know him better as lead pastor. Is that your official title?
I think they call me that. Yeah.
I think they call you that, the lead pastor at Life Community Church here in Bluffton. So welcome, Steve. Thanks for joining us.
I'm glad you reached out.
I am glad. I'm glad you like coffee, and I happened to see you there at Hughes because that's how this all came to be. I've known Steve, I've known you since middle school probably, but our friendship probably didn't really start developing more until high school on the swim team. But if you would just give us a brief kind of rundown of your faith journey, because I know unlike many pastors, ours excluded, many pastors have just kind of grown up in the church, and you have a little different story. I'd like to kind of maybe see how that journey was for you.
Yeah, so it certainly wasn't, the idea of being a pastor wasn't modeled in my home and when I grew up. I will say that I give my parents all the grace in the world for doing as best as they could with the circumstances they had in their lives. So I don't look back on my youth with any sort of maligned eyes to say, why didn't this happen? And we went to church essentially when I was really small. I think we went to Sunlight for a number of years. I don't really remember much, but the majority of my youth was not going to church on a Sunday, and sort of was bent around playing with toys, and we had big playground equipment in our backyard, and certainly we stayed around the house a lot. So I really didn't have any biblical background. I didn't have any faith background. Early in middle school, I was late in middle school, I was what they call a late bloomer, and so a lot of my friends were maturing, and they were getting leg hair, and I wasn't, and so that was really hard because they were talking about girls, and I honestly think it's okay to talk about the fact that I was talking about Beavis and Butthead probably when I was in 7th or 8th grade, and I just remember one specific moment that my awkwardness came to my own self, like I'm awkward for them.
Yeah.
And so that sort of journeyed along with some other things that were going on in my life into sort of depression, self-worth issues, self-esteem. That's a journey that a lot of people have come through, and kind of had just consumed myself with sports, just being an athlete, and wouldn't say I had any close friends, probably when I was in 7th or 8th grade, even 9th or sophomore year, just was journeying and just trying to do my thing. And but then sort of through essentially your dad was a part of it, and he'll, we can talk about your dad a little bit later, but the Youth for Christ program at Bluffton was something that came onto my radar, and it only came onto my radar because there are people within that, kids within that group that included me into that group. So it was probably my junior year that I really got going in that, and figured out there was something else to life than just sort of the mundanes of school and the excitement of sports, and then just trying to get to my sport again. And so I accepted Christ when I was a junior. I know that moment was in my living room right across the street with your dad. Honestly, that I look at that decision, I don't know if there was much change in my life at that point, but really kind of began the journey. And then the great John Dustman came over, I think probably because his mom and dad made him to, and invited me to come over here for a youth group with Jimmy, and you were there, and certainly got plugged into the church here, and went away to college. And I don't know if you want to hear more about that, or...
Yeah, so when was it then where you started feeling the nudge to get into ministry? Was it in those years, or was it earlier on, or was it?
So that's a little bit convoluted, if I can be honest. There were a lot of felt needs that I was working off early in my Christian faith, and rightfully so. I think God meets us where we're at. So I think the idea of going into ministry was manifested out of what that ministry had sort of given to me. And so I wanted to essentially be as cool and do for others what had been done for me. So I don't know if necessarily my motivations to go into ministry at the beginning were fabulous. If that, I wanted to help kids, and I wanted to help. I loved Jesus in the best of ways that I could, and I just saw myself fitting in that world, and I was sort of affirmed along the way everywhere I went. Like, hey, you've got some tools, you've got some giftings, you have uniqueness about you that I think you will do well in this. And so I just sort of journeyed that way further and further into ministry. You
were active with our mutual friend Chris Mishler as well down there, weren't you?
Yep. So yeah, Youth for Christ. So your dad, Dennis, was certainly an important piece in my life, and then he came here to be the worship pastor when I was a senior. And then Chris Mishler, who came in for 1 year at Bluffton and lived in Alexandria.
Was it only a year?
For only a year,
wow.
Yeah. Lived in Alexandria and made an impact on me, and I think a lot of people in our age group would say that. And then, I chose to go to Ball State because they accepted me, and I learned that my ACT score was going to be acceptable down there, and so I was like, that's where we're going to go. I knew that I wanted to sort of I wasn't trying to flee Bluffton. I knew that I wanted to kind of create my own story in some ways. So I went down there, and it just happens that Chris lived down in that area and was commuting to Bluffton to do his job here. And then he opened up Muncie Area Youth for Christ, and I came along as a volunteer and then a staff member. Yep.
So you mentioned the impact that like Youth for Christ and Mishler and my dad have had on that. Is there anyone else that kind of stands out really on your journey, like on your walk, your faith walk?
I mean, there are several. I would say there are several different moments in my life. I would say podcasts have played certain roles in my life that I would not sort of espouse my congregation to use podcasts maybe the way that I've used podcasts in my life, which I think it's a good thing. This is a podcast, I know. Yeah. There's some Bible teachers. When I met my wife in college, Nikki, she's the better end of this deal, and then I would go to church with her at a place called Harvest Fellowship in Fort Wayne. There was a guy named Paul Mowry there, and he taught Scripture in a way that I had never heard it before. Now, I went to FCC for many years, and I'll say this, that and I have to remember this as a pastor, I don't remember anything. Like, I don't remember anything that was taught here. Yeah. I don't remember anything in the youth group. What I do remember is people being available to me. Yeah. What I do is that people celebrated, maybe a strong word, but like they enjoyed my presence here. They wanted me. And that was sort of a big deal, to be wanted when you're struggling with self-esteem and self-worth.
Well, and otherwise too. I mean, it's not the people with low self-esteem who need a relationship. Like that's it's kind of like a call, a wake-up call for all of us, like, from an outside looking in, like, how are we on a Sunday morning, like, to that person who needs that?
Yeah.
And like that, yeah, just kind of a wake-up call. Like, we need to always be mindful of that.
Yeah, so I attended with her at Harvest, and he just taught the Bible in a way that I had never heard it taught before. He just went through verse for verse in the Bible and sort of taught it. And so that really started, like, I remember registering that there was something meaty here that I hadn't known myself. I was really never, I was surviving a lot on feeling, and that was only getting me so far, and causing a lot of guilt and shame in my life because I wasn't the person that I thought I should be, and I certainly wasn't the person that I think other people thought I was.
Yeah. I like that imagery there. What you said there. You're trying to get by on feeling, I think you said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What do you mean? What do you mean by that exactly?
Well, I think that's not unique to our experiences, probably in some ways, but
right.
I don't. So, I think for a young kid, you sort of survive on peak emotional moments, and you sort of think that you're closer to God. So I need to go to this retreat, or I need to go to this camp, I need to go to this event, because there's a possibility there I'm going to feel something, and I'm going to feel like I'm close to God. And when I don't have those things in my life, then I feel somehow that I'm distant from God. And so a lot of my faith early on was sort of surviving by moments of emotion that sort of fed into other emotions that kept me sustained for a while. And all that time, I was still sort of really struggling with some really deep, flawed understanding of myself, and just trying to prop myself up to look good, because I was supposed to be this person.
Yeah, that kind of leads in, like, to this idea of this kind of honeymoon period that we have when we first become believers, and we're all on fire and gung ho and running on that energy that initial excitement that we have from, like, now we can call ourselves a child of God. We're not just one of His creations. We're like one of His children. Like, so is that, would you agree? Like, you kind of had that period, or what did that look like for you when you?
I don't know if my delight was being an adopted son or daughter of God, as much as my delight was in that people liked me.
Gotcha.
And so I delighted in the fact that I had a place, and I felt accepted, and I felt belonging, and sort of I connected those ideas with Christianity and my faith really early. That was good.
And is part of it.
It's part of it. Yeah. But I never transitioned into anything sort of else for quite some time in my life. So that honeymoon phase was there. But I will say this: I probably had about 20 different honeymoon moments in my life.
Ups and downs.
Just ups and downs. I go to something and I'd be excited. Or somehow miraculously, which it is miraculously, a kid would come to Christ, and I'd think, oh yes, and then I'd get excited about that, and just moment to moment to moment to moment to moment, yeah, honeymoon moments, because that's what I thought. That's sort of what I thought being a Christian was. I thought you had to be on fire. I thought you had to be happy clappy Christian guy. That just loved Jesus and was overt with his faith, and I wanted to be that person, and it didn't register in me that God wires us all differently, and that that's okay. I don't have to be that person. It took me a while.
Well, that's very cool. I certainly didn't know all that about you, and I've always liked you. Just
well, thank you. See, I'm up on a peak moment now.
Okay. So I want to kind of transition just really quick, and I've got this idea in my head, and I kind of mentioned to you already, but So us coming from different backgrounds, I was raised in the church all my life. I grew up in a Christian home, and from very early on, I knew. I mean, a pastor, being a pastor's son too. From very early on, I got an early education in theology, even, and so all. I mean, even not just the Bible stories, but what it meant and what and who God is. That kind of stuff was ingrained in me. So we've already kind of paralleled like our different upbringings, but I want to reference or parallel that to the story in the Old Testament of the prodigal son. And for me as a Christian who I accepted Christ very early on, I was like 12 years old. I got baptized up at Lake James Christian Assembly, and from then on, like I expected this big like coming home moment, and I finally I've been waiting for this this day, like I'm gonna make it official, I'm gonna get baptized, and I wanted this big like coming home party, like the story of the prodigal son, when the son comes back and he gets accepted, and his father throws a big party. But as I went on, I tended to want to relate more to the second brother, the older brother, who had never left, who had never strayed, who had always grown up in his father's house, and had just been there. And looking on that moment with a little bit of jealousy, I guess, but longing, I feel like I want that moment for myself too. So I've always related more to the second brother than I have to the lost, to the prodigal son, who was lost and came back. Did you? How do you?
Well, first of all, I would say I felt that jealousy when I was in high school.
Oh, you did.
I could see you looking at me and go,
"Okay,
everybody's loving this guy. What about me?"
Yeah,
I kid.
But curious, like in that story, do you feel like you can relate to the lost son? Like, did you feel that moment like a party, or is it still?
Yeah, I would say that I didn't know that I was lost. So there's a different. I never had sort of the faithfulness of the Father displayed in my life in a way that I knew that to be able to reject it and then come back to it. So I didn't. I certainly felt like people, and I think in general we celebrate people coming to the Lord more than we celebrate the faithful follower of Jesus. But my prayer for my girls every night is that they would not know a day in their life where they didn't lean and trust in the name of the Lord.
Absolutely.
And that their testimony would be boring, that they would trust in His faithfulness to them. So and I don't want to get into a sort of deeper theological understanding. I think as the church, one of the things that we can err on is that we elevate the believer that just came to faith, and we put a measure of celebration on them in a way that you do feel like the older brother. But what we don't tend to glorify as much is the faithful follower of Jesus that has walked 20 years. That person doesn't get in as much play in the congregation or celebration. I don't know that you're following me on this.
Oh yeah.
But that's
go on.
Give me more. But that's some of the reason why I think I struggled, because we were always putting somebody up there who had a dramatic testimony, who was on fire for Jesus, and I thought that I was supposed to be that person. But there are amazing, like, here's my heart today. The person that's been walking with the Lord for 40 years, I want to hear their story, because they have gone through the honeymoon, and they have felt the valley, and they know what it means to walk with the Lord. And so that has been powerfully changing in my perspective of what it means to be a follower of Jesus.
That's awesome. And none of that's to say that the lost son coming home, or the first time believer who never knew anything, and not to say that that experienced, long-term believer has anything above them either, but we are,
It is exciting.
Yeah.
Is it exciting? We exist in a little bit of a marketing bubble within the church in America today. And so we know what is exciting to people. And sometimes if we're not careful, we can sort of market towards that excitement and sort of forget faithfulness over here. I don't know if that makes sense at all.
Oh, yeah. Totally.
So I mean, there is nothing better than somebody coming to know the Lord and being baptized, but they aren't worth any more than... and what has happened, I'll say this, in our church is we constantly have celebrated this, but those people leave. So they get a measure of celebration, and then we spotlight them and talk about them, and they crush under that weight.
Mm.
They get crushed under that weight because they're just drinking milk, and we're putting a huge yoke on them to say that, look at this person, instead of letting them have time to season. This is a deeper...
that's interesting. Yeah, I've never thought of that before.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Well, you mentioned like kind of the highs and lows, especially the, being fueled by feelings or emotions, or even just, like looking for the next thing to spark your flame or, fan your fire. What are some of the things that we can do to keep our relationship with God fresh and just ever growing?
Those are great questions. I'll try to look back on your podcast here to see if I can find some better answers than what I'm going to give.
Okay.
But, there are profound moments of change in my life, and a lot of them stem around, the scripture says, don't think more of yourself than you ought to. I think the profound changes in my life were when I actually saw myself for who I am, and I mean that in a way that I actually view myself really small in comparison to who God was. And so what I would describe that as, when I read Scripture, I read myself into Scripture. I read this was about me, that was about me, this was about me. It was when I realized that the story of Scripture is the story of God, and all of it painted this beautiful picture of a gigantic God who is bigger than I could imagine. And when I humbled myself to see myself as small compared to Him, it was a tremendous freedom. Because I always sort of thought that I was 67% good, and I just needed Jesus for that other 33% to kind of get me over the top. But when I learned and understood that I was 0, and that God was 100, and that I deserved punishment, I deserved wrath, but I have a loving Father who gracefully bestowed to me adoption, and I can trust Him that He is good and He delights in His children. So that makes me, in every situation of my life, try to make myself smaller. And so if I'm in a really difficult situation, like, I don't know, my son Asa was born 3 months ago, and he almost died during delivery. I just had to sit in that bed as he wasn't breathing and didn't breathe when he left the room. This almost full-term baby that came out blue and not moving, and just repeated over and over, just the words that came, that God, you are just as faithful in this moment as you will be tomorrow and as you were yesterday. And the more I make it about God and the less I make it about me, the better my life flows. So that's what I try to teach. I have one sermon at life. I just have one sermon. I'm sure Brandon or somebody else might understand what that means. My whole sermon is, we live in a very self-centered age, and that's okay. But we have got to get our eyes off ourselves, and we've got to make ourselves small, and realize the size of God that we have, because it just brings so much freedom to my life to know that it's not about me, and it's never going to be. So I don't know if that is answering your question.
I mean, yeah, if you can, I mean, the question was what? Hey, how do you keep that relationship fresh? And if if it's, even if it's something simple like a daily reminder that you are not and he is, you know?
But here's everything. We're Sunday, this is from Sunday, so restlessness amongst abundance probably could be traced as the original sin. This abundant garden that God gives us, and yet creation was restless for something more. I am restless every single day in an abundance of flourishing and thriving, if you can do that words. And it's easy for me to make it about myself. But that's a false gospel, and it's not fresh water. I have to deny that part of me.
Yeah. Are there, as we kind of wrap up here, are there any resources or tips or anything that you could recommend to someone who's maybe looking to push just a little deeper in their faith? Prayer is effective, and I don't want to. When I was growing up in my house and I didn't have faith, I don't know why I prayed, but I prayed. I didn't. And the only prayer that I ever have prayed consistently is that, Lord, give me the kind of faith like that. Like, give me the kind of faith of whatever person I saw or esteemed, or what I even, as I eventually read. And so God's faithful to answer his prayers. I don't have great practical tips outside of, like, you got to think about yourself less, and you got to realize just how awesome our God is, and you just have to be fervent in your prayers that are within the will of God. And I would just I would say people just need to pray that the Lord would give them the kind of faithfulness that is going to be needed in the journey ahead for the rest of our lives. That's great. Well, Steve, thank you so much for joining me here today. I hope you guys were able to take away a whole lot out of there. You just heard Steve's one sermon. So we appreciate it. Guys, thanks for tuning in, and I hope to see you again next week on The Thrive Show. Have a good week.